welcome to the Raptors Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, Samson Folk, and today another draft-focused podcast because that's kind of what we've been doing. We are in the limbo, the flux between the draft and Summer League. For the Raptors, at least, Scottie Barnes, Dalano Banton, and David Johnson await, among other players, guys who are trying to get into the league. But we're talking about the youngins today, and somebody who specializes in the draft, specializes in basketball philosophy. I had to get him on this podcast before he, like many other people on Twitter who have great conversations and great insights, gets hired to an NBA team, obviously. So we're getting him in early. Henry Ward, you can find him on Twitter at Henry W. Ward. There's some middle name minutia there that we won't get into. But Henry, I appreciate your insights very much so, and I'm excited to hear them. How you doing, man?
I'm good, Samson. Thank you for having me on. I've been an enjoyer of your content, whether it be this or bouncing around for a little bit, and it's exciting to have a nice little basketball philosophical chat with a very Raptors heavy focus, considering they're now they've stolen my allegiance away from my hometown Los Angeles Clippers. So I'm excited. This feels like a birth of some kind.
Let's follow that thought then. Let's follow that thread. So the Raptors are now one of, if not the biggest team in your life. What is the main reason for that? What is the impetus?
Sure. So I'll save. I'm sure we'll get into a much grander discussion on the specifics of this later. But basically, I've been anyone who's enjoyed any of my tweets on Twitter or any article I've written have probably enjoyed it for a certain level of insight into this philosophy I have of where basketball is going. And like I said, we'll describe some of that later, I imagine. But basically, the Raptors have, in multiple forms, in multiple mediums over the last 2 weeks, fully made it aware that they see things in a very similar way that I do. First with the decision to take Scottie Barnes fourth, soon followed by the drafting of Dalano Banton and David Johnson with their second-round picks, and then sort of culminating in a quote from Bobby Webster, I believe the day after the draft, that basically was an excellent 2-sentence summary of like everything I've sort of espoused for the last 2 years on Twitter, which is all very exciting, especially because there's obviously many other reasons to be excited about the Raptors and, their history of development and recent success. And also it's kind of cool to root for an international team. Great branding. There's a lot to get behind, and I'm just excited to be here for the ride.
So partial is that there's, the Venn diagram of your philosophy in the Raptors appears to be a circle. There's also some cachet in cheering for a boutique international team because you're a fancy Renaissance man. That's what I'm getting from it. But okay, let's do Scottie Barnes, because I had PD Webb on the podcast to talk about Scottie Barnes. And while he likes Scottie Barnes a lot, he and I probably share more skepticism for some aspects of his game and the overall team building from what we can tell with the Raptors. You, on the other hand, you represent the other side of the spectrum where you're smashing the like button like, hell yes, please more. So Scottie Barnes, let's do the cliff notes of what you think of him first, and then we'll start to dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, so I listened to the podcast with PD over the last couple of days, and it's funny, PD and I have a lot of great discussions. I mean, I'm sure many people have discussions with PD would find them great, but we often find ourselves in a place where we kind of like to make fun of each other for our most stringent opinions, but ultimately understanding that at the end, like the core of those opinions is often pretty similar. And what I mean by that is listening to your guys' podcast, it's like there's not really anything PD said about Scottie Barnes that I disagree with. It's just that at the end of the day, the player that PD described is much more attractive to me than it is to PD from a team building perspective. So I guess the abbreviated cliff notes, because I'm sure listeners have, or if you haven't, you have to listen to that episode. But PD did a pretty good job outlining them. Essentially, you have a 6'9", wide-bodied, functionally athletic in some ways, functionally very unathletic in other ways, incredibly smart, incredibly predictive, proactive, high-field player on both ends, who is this kind of some people might find it weird and dissatisfying. I find it incredibly fun. Amorphous blob of kind of positionless player who is, like I said, this kind of giant guy who's not super athletic. He's sort of wing size, but he's kind of more glued to the ground in a way you'd predict a 4 would be. Not the best handler, but excels in skills that you would think come after kind of more ball handling centric action, if that makes sense. Like an unbelievable passer, both on the perimeter and also in short roll opportunities. Has that kind of it is proactive, but it's a different level of passing to where it's not the sort of passing where you're drawing defenders and finding the open guy consistently. It's a lot of, I'm going to stand in this one area and other players are going to move around, and I'm going to decide which player I want to get open with my eyes, and then I'm going to throw it to that player. A lot of chess being played, which is super fun to watch, and it's kind of one of my favorite traits to find in a player. But yeah, I think the skeptics would say, there's concern about position, there's concern about athleticism, there's concern about shooting. And I think, even more kind of diabolical skeptics would wonder how the sort of standout skills make themselves felt because of those deficiencies. If he's not shooting, how is he scoring? If he's not scoring, how is he creating these passing opportunities, et cetera? As a believer, I would say a lot of that kind of standout skill makes itself felt, because those concerns aren't maybe as important as they feel sometimes, which I'm sure we'll get into with the philosophy stuff. And also just because he's so good at them, and basketball is such a dynamic game that it's not really like the assumption that you can take, if you can just allow a guy to score and he can't score, and just take away passing is kind of true. And it's functional, especially in sort of pick and roll stuff. But the way Scottie operates with his quick decision-making and manipulation and just general incredibly high feel, he'll find ways, and he has at every level so far. And it's been through, like I said, perimeter playmaking, operating as kind of like this big ball handler, even as like a point guard sometimes, running in transition. There will be ways that he is effective despite some concerns. So I would say that is my addendum to PD's previous clip notes.
Okay, so let's kind of hammer into things, and this may be a little bit unfair, but what you might expect him to succeed at, because you said there will be some avenues to success, and these don't have to be extremely bold claims, but in the NBA context, at the NBA level, what are you expecting to see Scottie Barnes do at a decent level in his first year? Because rookies are typically not very good from the jump.
Yeah, I would say he's definitely going to be a plus passer, especially in positionally. You're going to see there are going to be moments he's going to have, kind of league pass highlight moments where he throws kind of no-look darts into the dunker spot, or overhead whips to the opposite corner on a short roll where it's like, wow, that's a passer. That guy can play. Like a little, in a way that maybe we're not seeing out of good pick and roll ball handlers that aren't elite, that throw nice passes. Like it's not even going to be a Darius Garland type thing. It's going to, I think, be more jarring in the way that like a Luka or a LeBron or a Jokic type passer is. And that was obviously hefty company to put him in, but just saying purely from the stylistic standpoint of like, whoa, that pass was not something I could have perceived until he threw it, even as just a passive observer. Defensive versatility is going to be a huge plus. And this is actually an interesting point, because I think it's going to depend. Your opinion of Scottie in his rookie year is going to depend a lot on how much you value like individual skill versus what individual skill does for a team context. Like you're not going to see Scottie sort of switching 1 through 5, picking up point guards full court like he did in college. All that kind of like more eye-grabbing stuff that makes him exciting as a kind of multi-positional defender. But it will be in sort of the subtext a very exciting thing to see him cover responsibilities for guys that are out of place, communicate through actions that otherwise would be basically exploited into easy buckets, scram guys out of switches, all the kind of little things that is like, that could have been a killed defensive possession. And because Scottie was on the court, it wasn't. There'll be moments like that. So I would say the two biggest things in his rookie year will be those, both the passing and then the kind of general mistake, kind of janitor aspect of his defense. Those are the two things I would imagine are most exciting.
This, for Raptors fans, this should remind them of a player who's already on the roster, a problem solver, defensively. A problem arises after an advantage is created, and they solve that problem with their ability to cover the court and help their teammates out. OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam are both capable of doing that. What do you make of the three-pronged defensive attack, let's say, of those three guys, plus Fred VanVleet at the point of attack or tracking, let's say, a particularly potent off-guard or off-ball guard, off-ball, if that's what they're doing? Like that nucleus of those four guys, do you have any particular expectations for what that defense might look like?
Yeah, I mean, that is, and again, I keep alluding to this later discussion of philosophy, but that is going to be, that's going to be the crux of their identity in my estimation, and as it should be. Basically, the defensively on that, with that group, what you're banking on a lot of is there's going to be sort of alternatives that have not previously sort of been either considered or measured in a way, just because there's so much, even though there's obviously grand difference across schemes in the NBA defensively, it's more on the kind of minutia level. It's sort of like, how are we going to, where are we going to force this drive? Where is the help coming from? Those sort of things. And the Raptors, with that kind of lineup, will sort of, I hope, demonstrate an alternative, which is, currently rim protection in the NBA is all very much, how are we going to alter a shot at the rim? How is, if this rim attempt is going to occur, or there's going to be 2 feet in the paint around the restricted area, how are we going to affect that attempt and lower over the course of the season, lower those percentages for other teams? This kind of new lineup that the Raptors obviously deploying, or would be theoretically deploying, is kind of hinges on not letting people get to those points as often. Like, it's going to be rim deterrence, not through, oh, there's a guy sitting in front of me, but I thought I was going to shoot a layup and I'm not going to shoot it now. But rim deterrence in, well, this guy's just not going to get 2 feet in the paint to shoot a layup. That is where the value of that sort of lineup stands to me, is keeping players out of opportune positions to start with, knowing that obviously to do that, there is a sacrifice in a sense that when they do get those rim attempts, that they will be easier. You don't have a Rudy Gobert or Clint Capella to sort of kind of funnel everything to and hope for the best in terms of making life difficult for finishers. But the plan, I imagine, would be, and I would hope would be, to, through having 4 or 5 super athletic long guys, play more versatile coverages, not in the sense of, oh, we're trapping every screen, we're switching every screen, we're soft switching, but in a sense that you're not going to have any one guy get torched, then, and also in the sense that those, whatever one's at the point of attack, you're going to have 2 or 3 off the ball who are incredibly potent in their rotations and their ground coverage and ability to sort of cover the mistakes in that way. And through that, you're going to have a result that hopefully kind of, with a over, bird's eye view, looks somewhat similar in the sense that the shot charts are similar to what you'd hope for out of a good defense. The percentages remain the same in terms of, you're forcing a lot of kind of, you're not letting a lot of open corner threes. You're not kind of allowing a ton of rim attempts. You're hoping for more things in the intermediate and above the break. That's still very possible with this kind of defense. It's going to be a much different avenue to arrive there, however.
Okay, let's do offense. When I think of how people operate offensively, this is something I wrote about from Minute Basketball, was that Kyle Lowry is a player who harnesses chaos on the court. And for example, Chris Paul and LeBron James are guys who I would say limit chaos. And the Raptors operated in the ethos of Kyle Lowry's whole sphere. It's just, what is Kyle Lowry doing? Let's play Kyle Lowry basketball for a long time now. That time has passed. He signed with the Heat in a sign-and trade, which I think still isn't done on the Raptors' end. They're still working out the details of it. I haven't seen anything reported. If that happens during this podcast or before it's out, my apologies. But Fred VanVleet is a guy who is not somebody who leaves such an imprint on the game as Kyle Lowry, Chris Paul, or LeBron James would. But I do see him as a player who more so limits chaos offensively. He has very rudimentary reads. He creates the same advantage over and over, whereas most recently the Raptors had been a read and react team behind Kyle Lowry, where his reads, his interpretations of all the different ways the defense defended that led to unique advantages that in a lot of times Pascal Siakam, when he wasn't the primary creator, would take advantage of. OG Anunoby, a lot of pick and pops and a lot of short rolls into space for Serge Ibaka, Marcus Gasol, Valanciunas, stuff like that. Scottie Barnes appears to be entering a context where the half-court offense will be extremely limited in, let's say, chaos. They appear to be bereft of advantage creation, which if you listen to the last podcast, PD gave, I think, the perfect breakdown on. And in transition and defensively, they will have a ton of chaos. But more so in the half court, what do you think of the Raptors as a context to kind of harbor his abilities?
Yeah, that chaos is necessary because, of course, chaos is where openings are created. That's, I think, what advantage creation hinges on. It's just going to have to be created through a much more obscure creative lens. Like, it's not going to happen through, probably the most frustrating thing for me watching basketball at a lot of levels at this point is how much advantage creation, the responsibility is always just placed on players. It's, can the player create an advantage? Is this player valuable because they can or cannot create an advantage? So-and-so is such a valuable player for in the draft or as a recruit or as a free agent because they create advantages. And that's all true because advantages are ultimately what you operate out of to create quality looks in offense. It's the chaos that you alluded to that comes out of those advantages. But the onus is never placed on the coaching staff and on the architects of play design. And, we know that there are obviously sets running the NBA, maybe less so than there were 20 years ago. But it's not like everything is a sort of improvisation. And so there's no real teaching of that's not true. It's very unfair to say there's no real teaching of playing with principles, but there's very much more so a kind of impetus on the player to create advantages for their team. And they will do so with the relative aid of sets, whether it be spread pick and rolls or Spain pick and rolls or, Miami actions, Knicks actions, whatever it is. Those are all kind of quick hitting actions and sets that we know and are honestly fun to watch. And as enthusiasts, we geek out on. However, there's not a lot of teaching of, like logically passing principles of how to create advantages. And what I mean by that is and again, this has never been tested. So I've seen it happen at the college level and in high school and even at youth levels in terms of how you can scheme these things. But there are some like relatively simple principles that if taught and like executed pretty often would be pretty hard to guard. Sort of like guided relocations into kind of pretty simple passing reads that currently aren't being used. The one I kind of talk about the most and think about is like the fill behind pass. If someone drives right and the person that's to the left of them relocates to behind them, that pass is almost always open because that sink is pretty hard to get to from wherever that sink is, the top of the key, or the wing or wherever the drive came from. And just little things like that. There are ways my grander point, the minutia is less important. My grander point is that there are ways to scheme advantage, and that will be critical for the Raptors. Is how they actually scheme those advantages and not rely on these sort of agents of chaos that have become kind of the pinnacle of basketball in the last 3 years. I guess they always have been, but more so in the last 3 years, you get that threshold feels like it's now been lowered to where like, Colin Sexton or DeMar DeRozan are so much more valuable than replacing player Y because they create advantages. But I guess the general idea is that the skills of others in sort of like with Scottie or OG or Pascal will only be extracted if those advantages are schemed because no one's going to be creating them from a static situation. And once they are schemed, then those skills that they do excel in really begin to shine. Like those are all very smart players who are quality passers. Obviously, Scottie, that's his main selling point. Shooting coming around for some of them is there for others. General ability to attack space when it's there is I think a major strength of that team. So it's going to be an odd test because it could look really, really bad, admittedly, if this scheming isn't kind of, maybe it's being attempted and not working. Maybe it's not being attempted in the right way. There's a potential for it to really be a disaster. But if it works, this could be kind of like a major inflection point for the NBA, realizing that you can succeed offensively without these traditional sort of high leverage scorers that have kind of been understood over the past 6 years to be necessary in a successful offense. So it's going to be fun. I mean, this is, again, why I'm going to be tracking the Raptors so tightly, is because this is sort of the first real data point I have of an NBA team trying something like this after kind of being my MO for the past 16 months.
Okay, so very interesting point. People who cover the Raptors, and I cover every Raptors game. A lot of people listen to the podcast. I do the reaction podcast. I break down the game like, oh, here's what I thought happened. Here's who was good. Here's a set that I thought was working, and they used it a few times and all that kind of stuff. It was less fun this past year because the Raptors were not very good and they struggled immensely. But something that was really easy to pick up on was that the Raptors are trying, even with Kyle Lowry, even with, typical guards, and not quite leaning as far into this every guy profiles as OG and Pascal per size thing. They don't run as many sets. They don't give as much schematic help for advantage creation as a lot of other teams. That's something the Raptors will probably have to try and help. Chris Finch did a decent job implementing some horn sets that the Raptors liked using this past year, but he obviously left to Minnesota midseason, which was rare, but it was a thing that happened. So all this to say, we're going to talk about the Miami Heat at the back end of this podcast, maybe of the past 2 years, as far as scheming advantages in a different leading scorer for each round of the playoffs as they went to the finals, hunting space and extrapolating advantage from scheme, all that kind of stuff. But we're not going to get to talk about it now. I just like what you said as far as how it might help or hinder Scottie. Breaking news, by the way, Masai Ujiri agreed to a significant new deal to become vice chairman and president of the Toronto Raptors. So,
wow,
no news on how much money or whatever, but what Adrian Wojnarowski reporting that Masai is not, in fact, leaving. So, the people who thought he might be leaving to go work with Barack Obama on some sort of thing, well-reasoned. Reasonable minds can disagree on that, but he's back with the Raptors. For how long? I'm not sure. I don't want to do a podcast fully on just like Masai Ujiri signed a deal. So, Masai, thanks for building a winning team and all that kind of stuff. But okay, we'll keep moving on, and we're going to talk about David Johnson. Now, you've said elsewhere that David Johnson was somewhat of a lottery talent in your eyes. And here he is in the middle of the second round, ripe for the picking of the Raptors. And I saw your reaction live, like on the TL and in the group chat. Very excited. Like, okay, if Toronto was my team before, it is beyond a doubt. So, David Johnson, what's the appeal right off the jump for you to view him as a lottery talent?
The appeal is a 6'5" plus wingspan, very, very good passer who will shoot long term and knows how to play and is kind of an exponentially good defensive processor. There's moments where I did a stream with our friend PD about David Johnson right before the draft, and a lot of this is probably more aptly covered there, but the spark notes are that there is a lot of hard to teach, really ceiling raising skills there, from the way he kind of his style of passing, which is very much not in the reactive mold, but more so in the I kind of know who's going to be open at any given moment. So I'm either going to give you the ball to give it to that open guy, or you're going to give the ball to me and I'm going to give it to the open guy. Having 5 players that are like that is really hard to guard. It's just, it becomes the more players you have on the court that think that way and can process things that fast. It becomes a really tough cover because there's nowhere to hide in the sense that there is at any point, because I mean the way defense operates in the NBA, and naturally so, is because everyone's getting more talented, more space, more space, more space. It hinges a lot on people covering responsibilities, but when you have players on offense, you can subsequently understand what those responsibilities are. There's someone always open on the NBA court, I guess is what I'm saying. And if you have players who can deliver it to those open players, more advantages are created because, of course, if someone's open, then they get the ball, there's then a scramble to deter their original shot or their original drive or whatever it may be. And from there, if that same player is the same sort of processor that someone like David Johnson is, you're in this endless kind of, once that first advantage is created, there's this domino effect of keeping an advantage, which is very valuable. So apart from the passing, it does hinge a lot on shooting developments. He was a good shooter in high school and AAU, struggled a bit his freshman year at Louisville. Both, it seemed like I don't think percentages were great, but also didn't shoot very much. So a little bit of like a regression in terms of confidence and role there. And then this past year, again, didn't shoot a ton, but shot more and also shot near 40% from three. Mechanics are good. I would believe in him being a good catch and shoot guy, never going to be like a real movement or off the dribble guy. He's not that level of shooter, but will space the floor by, and punish over helping off of him. And defensively, like I said, he's pretty built. He's strong. He can stick with guys. He's good at beating people to spots. A lot of his sort of style of defense is not as much kind of the twitchy mirroring, but like the large, big steps to cover ground and beat guys to angles and deter drives that way. And like I said, off the ball, he has moments where he looks kind of lost in the sense that he will have his back turned at a drive that comes right at him. But there are also moments in which he will process seemingly 9 defensive reads in the span of 5 seconds perfectly well, which leads me to believe that those bad moments are more a result of him kind of overthinking things. Which is a great problem to have on defense. If you're over processing things on a college court where there's feels like 10 screens being set at any one time, you're going to be just fine in the NBA. So that's the elevator pitch, I suppose. My lottery sort of push was that you get 5 guys that think like David Johnson, have the ancillary skills as well as the size. You're going to have a really nice little team product. I understand he maybe doesn't have the ceiling of a typical lottery guy. He's never going to be an on-ball creator. He's never going to be running pick and roll. I mean, he can run pick and rolls in a pinch, but he's never going to be like a guy you're feeding through pick and rolls. He's never going to be like a lethal shooter, or never going to be like a really excellent star in one situation, except for the passing. And in that way, it kind of feels like, my pitch would be you've acquired a really nice role player. A really, really nice role player who will definitely, contribute well to a championship level team at his peak. Understand that he's not going to be the second or third best player on one, but he will be on one and be an important part of one.
Okay, so the track record, you brought up, there's not going to be a ton of pick and roll, or he might not project as a guy who's just you're going to spam it to, even from a modicum to a great amount of success. But under Nick Nurse, the Raptors have been extremely, reluctant to give anybody that isn't between 5'10" and 6'1" a pick and roll possession. Pascal Siakam has been returning huge points per possession in his pick and roll possessions for 2 years now. They still don't run it. OG Anunoby, I hope he gets a lot of them this year just to see. I know you don't like the term threshold really, but just to see, how far it goes. What is he willing to kind of, where does his brain stop with what he allows for himself on the court? Like what is he going to take advantage of? How often can he do it in a game? Everybody has that. And the Raptors, typically for a guy of David Johnson's skill set and his physical profile, they're going to feed him a heavy dose of, if he's getting a heavy dose of anything, it's going to be flares, pin downs, dribble handoffs, and attacking closeouts. In those contexts, how do you view him as an offensive decision maker and finisher?
Decision making is really good. Like, I think if you get him in an advantage situation, he will 9 times out of 10 make the right decision. The tough part is he kind of has a little bit of, perfect being the enemy of good in those advantages. And again, this could be very much college context, just because college is so rigid and coaches like to have a ton of kind of control on what their guys are doing. But there's a lot of plays in this past year where he'll get an edge, but he's not overly quick, so that's part of it too, but he won't sort of exploit past the point of, he won't press that advantage into kind of making it a clear lane for himself. He'll most often turn his back into a post up or retreat back out, or settle for a little turnaround of some sort, which might kind of bite a team like the Raptors in the butt, because there's so much hinging on like that maintenance of advantage that once you have a pause, it's going to kind of be a killer in a possession sort of to possession basis. But I do think that there is value in kind of his pace. I mean, he was a point guard. Like, he was a point guard his freshman year, and then Louisville added this guy, Carlik Jones, who kind of took over the on-ball responsibilities this past year. But David Johnson at his core was a point guard. So there's still all those little kind of minutia with the pace he has in advantage situations. If he does kind of, if the advantage is good enough for him, he does show good pace. And like I said, he'll be a good catch and shoot guy. I do worry a little bit about, if you're like running David Johnson off flares, I don't think he sees himself as a level of shooter that's going to be like, catch and release on kind of like in flow with footwork type guy. It's going to be more, especially at the beginning, more of a, I have the ball now, and I should shoot it, and I'll shoot it, rather than like, I'm going to get this ball and shoot it, which is a pretty big difference in the NBA, especially if you're directly involved in the action. So I think there could be some concerns, some ugly moments perhaps with ball stoppages, but those ball stopping moments are not the product of my sort of pet peeve, which is ball stopping moments that happen from like, I can take this guy, or some sort of like personal acknowledgement of the situation being better if you have the ball, then the ball keeps moving. The ball stopping moments for DJ are going to be like, I thought through these 9 things and none of them are that good, and so I didn't get to the 10th thing before I could make a decision, which is a much more, from a process standpoint, much better and much healthier from a long-term perspective.
Do you think he's a candidate for a guy who might struggle immensely as a playmaker initially, but might have a boom later on then, if he starts to chunk like the reads at the NBA level?
I think that is fair. There is going to be a lot of it too, depends on what the Raptors see him as, because there's 2 very understandable schools of thought that you could view David Johnson in, and that is, one is like the big point guard who can't really shoot but is a very good passer, and one is the off-ball wing who will be able to shoot a little bit on catch and shoot situations and is better just advantage, or better kind of attacking advantages made for him in terms of like I said, more of that like advantage maintenance versus advantage creation. And my gut tells me the Raptors see him more in that second mold, kind of judging off of everyone else they took. But it's also possible, I mean, kind of what PD alluded to on the last podcast too, is like, maybe the Raptors' view isn't that they're going to like take these 3 kind of funky high IQ wings. Instead, they might be taking 2 of those guys, and their third, being David Johnson, is like more the point guard bet that PD alluded to that they might need, in which case I'd be a little bit more concerned. But the hope would be that he is like entered on day 1, sat down with whatever coaches are kind of responsible for his development, whether it be 905 or Toronto people, and kind of said like, look, here are the things you do well, and we'd love you to do them for us. And if those things are running pick and rolls, kind of operating from a standstill and having him make decisions from a more reactive standpoint, things might get ugly. If the vision is, you're going to be our 2 guard, our playing the 3 in a pinch, just to have some extra playmaking there positionally, and we're not worried about it because you have the length to guard wings, that are kind of smaller in stature. I don't think he's gonna be able to guard like, actual big wings, but two guards shouldn't be a problem for him. Then you should be thrilled. Then I think he's gonna look pretty good. And there's gonna be moments in the 905, I imagine, where if he is in that second role, he's gonna look too good for the G League. If he's put in the point guard situation, he's gonna look just at home in the G League, I think. But if he's like that connector wing and is playing, I don't know what the plans are for Malachi Flynn this year. If he's playing with Malachi as like the two guard, that could look really, really good, especially at the G League level. So there's ways it could go. I'm my entire MO for the last like 2 weeks has been just give the Raptors the benefit of the doubt. So I'm just going to keep doing that and thinking that they're going to view him as a wing and that things are going to materialize maybe quicker than the Raptors even thought, knowing that they took him with whatever it was, the 47th pick.
I expect Malachi to be at the NBA level because I think he's turning 24 this year. He's good. He had a really tough start to his NBA season, his NBA career, I should say, because it's tough to ask guys who are reliant on wiggle to create advantages to start wiggling against NBA defenses early, because you can look really bad if you try and wiggle on NBA defenders and it's not there. So there's like a confidence thing that those young guards have to get. And once he got it and he's like, okay, I can boogie here too, then he started operating in a better capacity. So I expect him to be at the NBA level. But Banton, maybe they get super funky and Johnson, maybe they invert it, like maybe it's Johnson at the 1, Banton at the 2 through 4, whatever the hell it is, or vice versa, except Johnson doesn't scale up defensively as much. Let's do Banton then. You've sold me on Johnson. I'm excited beyond all hell to watch him at Summer League. He came back with a video where he said, "We the North," like the Jalen Harris meme of last season. And so Banton, the first Canadian ever drafted by the Raptors. What are your thoughts on him? And obviously he seems to fit the mold of Henry's gorgeous basketball brain team.
Yes, he certainly does on paper. He's a 6'9", kind of plus movement guy, just funkfest who can pass.
Funkfest, I like a lot.
But it might be too much of a funkfest. I mean, I wasn't that high on Ben just because there's so much. Maybe it's like an aesthetic thing for me. I struggle to like kind of during the actual draft process. I'm not great at like analyzing the process while I'm in it. It's easier when you look back. And maybe I owe Banton some rewatching. But there's just so much weird stuff happening that it feels like that's a classic Toronto pick in the sense that like, we know what we've got in the armory in terms of player development stuff. Even though Phil Handy is gone, but they clearly believe in that system still. And maybe it's like, we've got these 2 second-round picks. Why not throw one at this weirdo who might, if he's good, be extremely useful in odd, sort of unforeseen context? And if he's not, so be it. I lean more in the camp that I don't really know like what he's doing. It's hard for a guy like Banton in a way that it isn't for Johnson, because Banton is not just by nature of being 6'9", he struggles with things that taller people struggle with in a way that Johnson doesn't. Like PD talked about this on the podcast as well, but like it's tough for 6'9" guys to keep a tight handle. Even if it's like tight handle for a 6'9" guy, it's just harder because there's more physical space between the ball and your hands with every move. And because you can't, and this is like the classic, I empathize with Dalano Banton because this is something that sucks for me in pickup a lot of times. I'm often one of the tallest people there and maybe sometimes tasked with being a ball handler. And you can't, I'm not fast. I don't have a lot of shift. My MO is very much like the spin dribble until you get an advantage, get your ass on the guy. When you're tall, that's hard to do because you're never going to be the lower guy. You're never going to have a center of gravity that's more kind of put in place than your defender. And Banton seems to struggle with those things. And I worry that there's just a lot of that, the things that make him special or interesting don't come to fruition for the kind of limiting factors. And it's interesting to kind of compare him to a guy like Scottie, because Scottie is kind of in that same mold of like, Scottie is like hyper Banton in some ways, I guess. But that you get diminishing returns kind of the more levels you downgrade off of the actual Scottie, in terms of like actual effectiveness, because those skill thresholds do matter. I think Scottie surpasses them, but once you don't surpass them, then it kind of sucks. And that's not to say Banton sucks. I think Banton is a good player and very interesting. It's just that it's his battle is going to be tough to make him a useful player in a context that's not obviously going to be, designed for him as a 46th pick. He's going to have to find ways that, maybe because in Nebraska, he was essentially like their point guard. Like he would run pick and rolls. He would do a lot of just like the classic kind of offensive point guard stuff. Bring the ball up, kind of like touch the ball 6 times a possession. And that's not his role at the next level, I don't think. I still think he's going to have to hold it. So it will require an adaptation that is possible given his feel, but it's just, it's hard to picture what's not there. So it's curious. I wonder, he's someone who I imagine will spend a ton of time with the 905. I would imagine the full year. So it'll be curious to see kind of how he fits in with those guys. But if he commits to like being this high feel sort of like 3, who's kind of this, maybe your point guard's more of a out there more for their defensive capabilities. I don't have the 905 roster in front of me, so I don't really know what he's going to be lined up with. But he could be like a kind of unique connector piece as like a point guard mind in a 6'9" body who's still playing the 3 or 4. It's just going to be a much more specific context for him to succeed as it would for maybe DJ or Sky, just because of the skill level difference. And for DJ, it's the difference in sort of ease in perceiving how he scales.
I think, yeah, that's a great point. He seems like the swing. He seems like 905 for a year, maybe 2, honestly, because it seems like with Banton, what you're betting on is that he's a guy who has a unique skill set for his position, who figured out a strange and unique way to operate at the college level. And strange and unique on the basketball court, funkfest, as coined by Henry Ward, is good typically, especially if you're a good player. So maybe they're saying, create another funkfest. It might not be the way you succeeded in college, but you have a unique body. You have a unique set of skills. John Wick, figure it out, make it happen. So I'm excited to see it. It's a great point you make, though, that like, just because you succeed at something at college, especially for these types of players, like with his body, does not mean it's going to happen. You bring up the dribbling. I like that too. In pickup, is your worst nightmare a guy like me who's like roughly 6 foot and like 180, sticking the knee under so you takes away your strength on the back down, but they can recover on the spin when you spin off the knee? Like what's your worst nightmare? The defensive matchup you hate?
If I'm tasked with the ball handling responsibilities, then my worst nightmare is like the twitchy guy who's like 5'11" or shorter, who really takes a lot of pride in not letting me get the ball up the court. That's just miserable to play against.
TJ McConnell.
Yeah, exactly. Like I guess I would compare myself to like Tyrese Halliburton. Like I'm a smart player, good passer, good shooter, but never really going to create an advantage that's not created for me. We've all seen the viral videos at this point that have circulated Twitter once or twice of me getting burned off the bounce by Mike De La Rosa. Certainly upright with tight hips and tight hamstrings to just limit me physically, and it's not a great handle. But if you put me with a point guard, we can make a lot of things work. But yeah, the stronger, more shifty, shorter guys, I get a lot of trouble with. You honestly do sound like a pretty heinous nightmare of mine on the pickup court.
Mike has a tight dribble. It's quite evident in that video. It's a nice little handle he's got there. But yeah, I think we can do basketball philosophy if you want to get into that with me.
Yeah, gladly.
This is what sets you apart from a lot of people who talk basketball. The wings agenda, something that I agree with the main thing that you're presenting there is that a wing, and correct me if I'm characterizing it or summing it up in the incorrect way, but a wing can couple together the best aspects of a big and the best aspects of a guard. Like LeBron James and Kevin Durant coming over to defend the front of the rim is insane in a way that a guard who can pull up the same way that Kevin Durant just can't do, except for like Drew Holiday and Kyle Lowry in transition for whatever reason, and Danny Green, I guess. But it's just use the term amorphous blob, by the way, which you're the only other person I've ever heard use that. But I want you to know, I use that, and it's so good. Amorphous blob, just plug it in anywhere.
Yep.
When you don't, that's what it is. Amorphous blob is an amorphous blob of a word. But okay, exactly. Yes, wings. And the guys who are like-sized to OG and Pascal, to bring it back to Bobby Webster, the Raptors GM after the draft, but the wing agenda, the like-sized, mid-sized guys agenda, philosophy, I'd like the cliff notes, and then I'd like to dig in with you.
Sure. I always have to think about how I want to start this, because I want to keep it. I could end up talking for an hour and not realizing about this stuff, and I'm just going in circles. So I have to plan this out a little bit. But I think the best. So I guess I can always start with the premise, which is that, we've seen basically everyone's gotten smarter. Everyone gets smarter every year with ways to exploit rule changes and personnel shifts and whatever. Space is everything. Space makes everything easier on offense, no matter how good your team is. Like, no matter how good anybody is at basketball, the more space you have to do stuff, the easier it is to make shots, to make passes, to dribble, to make decisions, to any facet of desirable offensive skill is easier to do in space, just by nature of the human brain and how we take in bandwidth and, easy to understand general processes. So what does that make? If I want to win with that premise, what do I want to do? Well, on offense, I want to maximize that space. On defense, I want to limit that space. So I guess we can start with offense. How am I going to maximize that space? I want 5 players who are all able to, maintain advantages, operate in space, and also off the ball, maintain that space, whether it be with shooting gravity or cutting sense, just general basketball sense in terms of like setting off all screens, or finding ways to kind of co-opt the defense to our willing, so that we can make sure that the opposing defenders are never in a place where they can overhelp without punishment. And you punish overhelping by exploiting the open space caused by overhelping, whether that be with shooting or cutting. And then with the ball, that is with, high level decision making, and of course the ability to make those shots. So, and I don't even, I could talk for hours and go on all the minutia of finishing and all that, and ball handling, all that stuff, but those are kind of the main points. And then defensively, of course, limiting space requires, of course, point of attack defenders who can, to the best of their ability, hold the ball in front of them so that overhelping isn't required. But understanding that, help is generally always required. Having guys who have the basketball sense to, when a scramble is forced, optimize that scramble to their will, so that the scramble, I guess, is minimized in the sense that you're not running, basically to the first guy you see, and then you end up covering more ground than you have to, but, covering the passes that are the easiest to make, covering the shooters that will punish the open space most, basically addressing the desires of the offense in the same order that they would kind of list their desires, if that makes sense. So you're taking away the first option first, you're taking away the second option second, taking away the third option third, and so forth. And then knowing that you have to help, a spectacular physical trait that is also kind of, I think, gelled with feel, is the ability to cover ground efficiently, so that you can have somebody who is forced into a 2-on-1 situation on the weak side can feasibly guard 2 at one time, can feasibly muck up that action with their length, with their speed, with their kind of, technique and wits, whatever it may be, enact their will so that advantages are stymied at least in a sense that it allows other defenders to get back into the play. And so with all that being understood, and also I should mention on-ball pressure is a very nice way to limit space, because on-ball pressure limits decision making. And so if you have guys that can provide that pressure, that's great. And in kind of every one of these sort of points has like two sides on the coin. And so if you're going to have on-ball pressure, one thing you probably need is some added rim protection. One way to kind of provide on-ball rim protection, on-ball pressure adequately is having players who can guard multiple positions, because the way the NBA operates, it's a lot of running guys off screens, and whether that be with the ball or without it. And screens, just by nature of like what people are allowed to do in the NBA, are hard to get around for anybody. So having guys that can switch, or having big defenders who can, when brought to the screen, if they're guarding the screener, can hedge hard and buy people time on the back end and make things hard for the ball handler. Those are things that are valuable as well. And then on that back end, if corners are turned, having players who can help protect the rim and not having it matter too much who it is and on that backside. So if it's your 2 or your 4, you're still getting some level of rim protection from the weak side. And now that essay is over, what is a player that can do all those things most often? It is most typically a 6'6" to 6'10" guy who can move well, who is, not as physically limited size-wise as a guard, not as physically limited sort of speed and agility-wise as a big, and also offensively kind of has those ball skills, has probably been taught a little bit to handle the ball and have that feel as a passer, to shoot a little bit. And so it's not that I am a wing truther in the sense of like wings for wing's sake. It's just that most often the guys that I value most in their skill sets and what they're able to do come in the form of wing size players. And I'm sure we'll kind of allude to, once we get to like through the granular actual philosophy stuff, we can talk more, I'm sure, about like the actual application of the Raptors here, because it seems like they're doing that. They're trying to get guys like OG, Scottie, Pascal, even like Boucher, who can move and be giant and have offensive weight, can carry offensive loads. That's a great way to win, in my opinion, and they're clearly kind of going after that, which is again why I'm a true Toronto guy now.
It's interesting to think about the 2019 76ers, because Joel Embiid, you have to kind of divorce him from that. And he helps a lot, obviously. Joel Embiid is a Defensive Player of the Year nominee. Year in, year out, he's extremely affecting on that end. But the Raptors in that series struggled immensely against the 76ers because of Embiid, yes, but also because of Tobias Harris, while not a super good defender, when he's on the weak side, passing angles are radically changed. Jimmy Butler, Ben Simmons, it's a large, and JJ Redick even, who has short arms, but he's still 6'4". It's the type of space you have on offense, and that's one of your big things, is limiting space for the offense as the defense. There is a very, very visible blueprint to success for defenses that play big in the middle. Like taking away the nail with bigger guys and longer guys is an extremely effective thing. But here's my big question, right, is everybody in the NBA wants wings. So where are you accessing the market inefficiency? Because everybody wants the wing like Jeff Green. Sorry, not Jeff Green. That's later. Everybody wants the wing that's like Kevin Durant or LeBron James or Jason Tatum. But are you accessing like Jeff Green or Michael Kidd-Gilchrist or Rondae Hollis-Jefferson? Where's the market inefficiency in this idea? Because I think that's where most new ideas are trying to operate, is in a market inefficiency.
I think the market inefficiency exists in the idea that, well, of course, I should also preface that, like, if you got access to like a generational talent, regardless of archetype or anything, like, I'm not eschewing Joel Embiid because he's too big and slow, right? Like, that's a silly thing to do. But I do think the market inefficiency lies in the idea that advantages, what we were talking about earlier, that advantages can be schemed and don't need to be created out of stagnation. And so that you are able to, if you're able to maintain a certain level of feel on the court, a certain level of kind of mismatching multi-positionality, versatile skill sets in the sense that, one guy is an okay shooter, a terrific passer. I'll just keep to one side of the ball for now because getting on both sides kind of complicates things. But it just turns into like a puzzle of if you've got a certain level of skills here and a certain level of skills there, you're able to create this kind of amalgam of like odd mismatch, but all pretty high floor ceiling raising players in their own way. Like I think of someone like David Johnson fitting with Scottie Barnes, both obviously tremendous passers, both not great shooters, but optimistic reasons for both, more so DJ than Scottie. But even though there's like a feel of overlap there in the sense that the archetype positionally is kind of similar in that Scottie, I guess you could say, is like a bigger, better version of DJ in some ways. The skills that are at the crux of make them good are not PD actually does a great job talking about this in his Patrick Williams piece from last year, is the idea of compound versus component skills. Component skills being skills that sort of, I don't want to botch the explanation, but they are skills that exist in vacuums. They are skills that make a player better and they help the team impact purely through the individual perspective. As a ball handler, and compound being the opposite of that. Compound skills being skills that, when put together, raise the acumen of skills for other players on the court. So me being a better ball handler on the court doesn't make you a better ball handler. Me being a better passer it opens things up for other players in a way that, a component skill like ball handling does not. Shooting is another one in that same sort of way. You've never had too much shooting on the court. You've never had too much passing on the court. You never had too much, ground coverage defensively on the court. Those kind of compound skills being the main focus, you can scheme openings that when you have 5 players with, highly skilled in compound areas, create this sort of sum greater than the whole situation where, or whole greater than the sum, I should say, where you don't need like this prolific advantage creator on the court to generate quality offense. And the hope would be that if you don't have that prolific advantage creator, because those often are just by nature of like development systems, the defensive sieves most of the time, you're not really giving anything up defensively either. So the roundabout answer to your question is like the market efficiency is viewing a team of like Patrick Williams, Joe Ingles, David Johnson, Scottie Barnes, and OG Anunoby at its peak. If everyone's in their primes there, that's like a team that I would, if coaching or if, forced to invest in, would like, I would see finishing much better than kind of individual stat models might predict, or kind of like more passive observers might predict. You say, oh, where's the star? Where's the advantage creation? Where's this, and that? They're more of a 7 or 8 seed, 6 seed. I would be like, no, that's like that's a 2 or a 3 seed. And so that is where the market inefficiency is the idea that you can put together a bunch of like connecting players and that you don't really need the idea of connecting players in the sense that we understand it now in the mainstream. It seems like is that connecting players are great at kind of piecing together more flawed parts that excel in areas that are harder to find, whether it be like rim protection through like a true 5 center who struggles offensively, and a 2 guard, a volume scoring 2 guard who's great at creating advantages but struggles a lot defensively. The connector was supposed to mold those 2 pieces together. Well, if you put 5 quote unquote connectors out there, I think there might be, again, we haven't seen it. My gut would tell me there's a real chance that team would outperform expectations.
Is there a team without a generational talent that has gotten close to your vision in any percentile type of way? Have you gotten 60% of the way there and been like, oh, I just need this guy on this team, something like that?
I would say the 2 best examples of like really reaching above the stars without having like a top 20 all-time player are last year's Jazz and the Heat of 2 years ago. Those are kind of the most recent examples that stand out in terms of obviously very talented teams. Like the Heat had Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, and the Jazz had Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell.
And
I
Mike
don't think a
Conley.
lot.
Evan Gualberto would kill me if I didn't say Mike Conley.
And Mike Conley. But you see how, there's not, we've kind of understood, and the Jazz, maybe the Jazz aren't the best example because they lost in the second round, but feasibly, if playoff series go their way, they were a 1 seed. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect them succeeding in a Western Conference final situation. And so you have obviously the Heat making the finals, and those are two teams kind of missing that. And I guess it's still true to an extent. We've kind of operated in the pretense that like every team that needs to be the best team in the league or be a top 3 team in the league has to have one of the top 3-5 players or some mix of the top 10 players. Those are two teams that didn't have that and came pretty darn close to kind of winning a championship. And I guess the Jazz obviously didn't, in the sense that they didn't make it that far in the playoffs, but won a ton of games using that stratosphere. So those are kind of my examples. Also because stylistically they make sense in the sense that they were sort of a team of connectors, very smart players. Granted, they each did have obviously some level of advantage creator with Mitchell and Butler. But that obviously those guys aren't viewed in the same lens as KD or Giannis or LeBron or Steph. But they did maximize the most out of their, say what you want. I'm a huge Duncan Robinson fan. I think we can all probably agree that Duncan Robinson is a highly flawed player who was maximized to his utmost, peak in that Heat finals run, as was Tyler Hero, as was Jay Crowder, as was the list goes on for the Jazz. It's Ingles and Bogdanovich and Royce O'Neal and George Niang, and maximizing those players, those connecting players, goes a long way in what you're ultimately able to create from a winning standpoint. And stylistically, a lot of that is reflected in the high level ball movement, very quick decision making, high level of off ball movement in terms of players moving around. So those, I would say, are the kind of the two best examples I have for the most recent kind of couple of years.
How different do you think playoff basketball is from regular season basketball?
Great question, because this is a very funny, it's a pet peeve of mine that comes up in discussion, which is, we'll win in the regular season. I think, I don't know, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but it feels like whenever there's discussion of regular season basketball, this team's built for the regular season or not built for the playoffs, it's a coded way of saying a team's actually not that good, but they'll try pretty hard and they have some skilled players that will, they're not maximized. They're not optimized. They're not an optimized team, but because the talent levels is there, they'll win enough games in the regular season. And so when you get to the postseason, the postseason, I think we all agree, is like the better product. Everyone's sort of most optimized, most maximized. The cream rises. And so in that sense, what's the difference between postseason and regular season basketball? Postseason basketball is like what you should be striving for in terms of like, I think our wires get crossed here, like not you and I, but me and some people I talk to on Twitter, in the sense of like, I'm always talking about building towards contention. And it's not always in the sense of like, you have to build towards contention because, I always get the counter arguments of like some small market teams don't have championship desires. They have playoff making desires and they have 7 seed desires. And that's great. I don't really care. My greater point is that building towards contention is what you should do, because the vision of playoff basketball is more representative of what good basketball actually is, in a sense of sustainable, optimized play. So if you build, if the regular season and the postseason basketball kind of silos are separated, why would you ever really build with the idea that you're limited? And I'm not doing a great job sort of explaining all the way, but it is like a slight pet peeve when when people argue, well, the Bulls, right? The Bulls are like the hot button example now. Like the Bulls aren't obviously playing for a title. You have to make the playoffs first. You gotta be a 6 seed first. Like that's great. I completely get it. And there's competing interests beyond just like winning titles. And of course there are. But my point being is that this like championship level team, whatever kind of the colloquialisms used to call it are, those are what you should ultimately be building towards, because they are optimized basketball. I think that's the crux of it, is we view them as two different things. But I think, like the postseason is a coded way of saying just more optimized play. And so that's what I think the difference is, and why I don't necessarily disagree that it's worthwhile to like try and make the playoffs if you're a small market team as opposed to winning a championship. But you can still do that by taking like the contender building approach, because that's just optimization. It's a different word for optimization. So I'm not sure if that really adequately answered your question. I'm more just fit in a rant there, but that is kind of where I see that difference being, and why it does frustrate me when people are, oh, well, aspirations are different. That's fine, but your aspirations can be different and also still have the same goal of optimizing talent and play. And then your aspirations might be, maybe you'll outshoot your aspirations. Who knows?
Okay, so the number one thing I would say, if I were a skeptic of the connectors and scheming advantage, the number one thing I would go to, A, is playoffs. And then within the playoffs context, that connecting advantages and scheme advantages evaporate. To what degree, I'm not completely sure, but they do evaporate, at least in some sense. Can a team that's built on schematic and connecting advantages, or advantage maintenance, like you said, live in that context, in that environment? You know what I mean? Like, what's your
100%.
response to that?
Well, that is what's so hard to judge, because there is like a natural tightening that happens on it's kind of in every player and coach in the finals, just because the stakes are so high and there's such a small sample that like you have to win 2 games. Like if you don't win these 2 games, you're screwed, and then the finals are over. Like it's kind of crazy. I mean, I understand obviously why it has to be this way, but like it's crazy that we play 82 games and then you make, then you win 12 and then you're in the finals. Like that's nuts. But and so because that happens, and because that's how the way things are, is because and consequently you have a tightening that ultimately results in like who has the better advantage creators, like who can, we saw this year, Giannis, there was no stopping Giannis the player, no matter what there was the Suns threw schematically, no matter what the Bucks decided to do offensively. Ultimately, it was a great resource for the Bucks coaching staff and players that Giannis Antetokounmpo could be given the ball at any moment, and you had about a 70% chance of getting a good shot out of that possession. That's the trump card that is like hard to beat, and you can't really argue with it. And again, of course, that should be the pinnacle of team building. It's like finding those players, more so than anything, because those are the kind of the needle pushers. But I guess my point would be, my counterpoint would be that we're yet to see a real kind of continuation of thought happening throughout the playoffs. And tons of credit to Eric Spoelstra, who got them there with kind of and granted, whatever, it was a bubble. But like, I think that's stupid, but people will say that. He got them there with this innovative offense that maximized the 5 players they played most, really brought along this like borderline lottery pick rookie and made him look like, there were conversations about, is he the next Devin Booker after this playoff series? He looked so good. There was a sort of reliance, understandably so, on playing the hits once you got down there, and like once the Miami actions, the double drags, the floppy sets, the pin-ins, once those weren't working, it was just spamming those things and hoping that they would somehow rise to the top again and like work through the adjustments that Vogel had put in. And to be fair, a lot of the talent, a lot of the finals, just because of the nature of that, does come down to talent right now. But we're yet to see like a continuous iteration, and it is hard. Maybe if you're honestly I'm now convincing myself a little bit against it, because it's so hard to input like really drastic changes in like the middle of a 7-game series. But that would be like my theoretical answer, is like continuing that iteration, so that, and it's incredibly hard to do. Like admittedly, it's a job I don't envy. But it would require some level of continuous iteration, so that when those pinions are taken away, when those Miami actions are taken away, and all the winning we had done via the Tyler Hero 2-on-1 with Bams, all those situations, once those had evaporated, well, let's go back to such and such, or let's try this now. And hopefully that would work. And again, the nature of how finals happen makes it kind of hard and borderline impossible. But that would be the idea for sure.
I have no problems with your philosophy at all, even if it's not the preeminent one in the NBA, because in the NBA currently, like you said, talent, other people need to have access to ways of thinking about basketball and trying to build teams that aren't just get the best players, because best players stack on the best teams, and how many teams in the NBA really have access to those guys? So what do you do in lieu of that? You try, and you've used the term optimization or optimize quite a few times in this podcast. You take, an ethos and you see how high you can get it. Sometimes teams and, eras in the NBA are dominated by a new ethos. It's keep looking. So that's why I was extremely excited to have you on to kind of hear this ethos and follow it down, follow the breadcrumbs to see where do you think it ends up. And so basically, let's bring it back to the Raptors then. Is there a reasonable expectation you have for a nucleus of Pascal? If he's around for the long term, it remains to be seen. There's still friction there, but Pascal, OG, Scottie, and then plugging in guys. But is there a reasonable expectation you have for their presumed style and that team?
I think short term, it's going to be probably, and of course, a lot of this hinges on like what Nurse decides to do. Because as we've hammered home, a lot of it's scheme reliant because it's not as much talent focused. You're hoping to maximize talent, and that would be done through scheme, as it is through team building, and that's in the process of happening. But a lot of it's scheme as well. So short term, if the maximization happens, it probably looks better than me. This is like a cop-out answer, it feels like, but it is the truth. It's like, if they are maximized in this way, they're going to look better than anyone thought they would in this first few years. If they're not, then they won't. But that is just kind of how it is. I think more so, maybe kind of more worthwhile for listeners of the podcast and Raptors fans, is the understanding that they are building an infrastructure that is really set to succeed once that high level talent is added. Like if you are one, high leverage advantage creator away from like a real championship roster in 4 years, which is, that's a great position to put yourself in. You don't know what happens in free agency. You don't know what happens in the draft. And that's why you continue to accumulate assets. But with the fourth pick, you weren't getting that guy. The only two in this draft that were really there were off the board. And so the best case you could do is build an infrastructure that is supportive of that guy when they do come, and that they have done. So again, not exactly sure how that does come in the end in terms of it requires max space to sign them, and then it's also funny because I guess an example too, it would be like, what if the Raptors had traded for Kevin Porter Jr.? Then you'd be set. So I guess there are maybe ways to do it that aren't the draft, that aren't the top 5 picks in the draft and through max slots in free agency, but those are most often the ways that they come about. And if that does, and when that does, they'll be in a great spot to maximize that.
There's one thing that could bring Robel back to Twitter. KPJ on the Raptors might rank pretty high on the list. Second rounder. I get there's like a bunch of other stuff going on with him at the time. I hope he's doing much better now on like a personal level, but he is a goddamn water dancer. He's incredible. Houston, man. That's like you have your idea of what basketball is and like what could be a really fun way to build. The vibes in Houston with Wood, Green, and Kevin Porter Jr. For me, I'm like, I'm going to watch a lot of Houston. I think Toronto, obviously, because it's my job to cover the games, but Houston and Chicago for the Hoopers vibes, I am absolutely tuning into a lot of those games this year. But Henry, is there anything else you'd like to impart upon the audience before we get out of here?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I'd have to add is listening back to you and PD's podcast. I have to concur with you that the UNC 1 low is the best Jordan 1. That's my take.
Wow. I like it. Maybe I'll have everybody listen to the previous podcasts, and I'll be an egomaniac like that. And then I'll have a running tally of everybody's favorite sneaker. And at the end of it, I'll make a graph, not a radar graph, because those are bad, even though people like them. But we'll leave it at that. Henry, thank you so much for coming on. I'm very happy to get you on before you inevitably go on to do bigger and better things in the basketball industry, whatever capacity that is. Thank you for sharing with us. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we get out of here?
I don't think so. Thank you, Samson. This was a blast. I'm glad we linked up. You're too kind with the compliments. I would just say the only plug for now is following my Twitter at Henry W. Ward. Some stuff to come, but that's all. That's the only plug for now.
I'll co-sign that Twitter. I enjoy following Henry a bunch, and I get a little bit smarter in whatever aspect he's talking about. And I think you should leave connoisseur. Maybe he'll start putting more ITYSL memes on the timeline. Who knows? But
I think that's the future.
Yeah, that's the future. It's not like-sized guys of OG and Pascal. I think you should leave. But Henry, or maybe since we're pals now, Hank, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you, Samson.
And listener, thanks for tuning in, whether you got into it in the morning or at night. Have a blessed day, and goodbye.